Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
We are chapter 11 of the book of Exodus. And last week we read verse 3. I didn't write down for some reason whether or not, there was no Rashi on verse 3. I didn't write down whether or not we had looked at a commentary on verse 3 by the Hamek Davar, the Netziv. Anyone remember that? Maybe I'll do it quickly just in case, because I always try to give at least one comment on a verse when Rashi is quiet. Okay, so chapter 11, verse 3. This is this extended scene where, on one hand, it seems that Moses has already left Pharaoh's presence. We discussed this several times, and then God tells Moses about the 10th plague, and then there seems to be an ongoing interaction between Moses and Pharaoh, but they've already left each other. Rashi's going to deal with that at a following verse. The audio. Okay, Hector, the Superman Hector is here to try to fix it. Okay. Vayitain Adonai adchein ha'am be'einei Mitzrayim, that God will give the grace of the people in the eyes of Egypt, meaning God's going to make the Egyptians feel positively towards the Israelites. Gam ha'ish Moshe, then there sort of seems to be like this significant gap in idea from the first half of that verse to the second half of the verse. And also, in addition to that, in case you're wondering, the man Moses is very large, be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt, be'inei avdei Pharaoh, and in the eyes of the servants of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of the people. And we tried to resolve that and discuss what might the connection be between the first half of the verse, the second half of the verse. And I wanted to give at least one commentary, and even if we did it last time, I'm going to do it again because I don't remember doing it. So maybe I didn't do it well. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. This is commentary of the Netziv Hamek Davar, who is a late 19th, early 20th century Lithuanian rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva. So he has two comments on the phrase Gam Ha'ish Moshe, even Moses. He says Afal Gav Sha'asa Lehem Ra'ah, and here the Hamek Davar is really just strengthening or articulating the question that needs being resolved. So even Moses, and he basically says that the Gam doesn't mean also like in addition to, almost like an emphasis. Even though Sha'asalahem Ra'a, that Moses had been the source of lots of negative things to the Israelites, even despite that, they had a positive feeling towards him. Next comment, Gadol Ma'od, etc., that he was very big, Be'inei Avdei Pharaoh, in the eyes of the servants of Pharaoh, which is kind of striking because they are suffering from 9 plagues already because of his interactions with Pharaoh. Shehema Kfar Hiskimu Sheyetzu Yisrael. The Netziv is saying definitively that by this part in the story, everyone is converted. Everyone in Egypt has converted from being on Pharaoh's side to being on the Egyptian side. They had already agreed that Israel should leave, right? Enough punishment. We yield, we cry uncle, let them go already. Pharaoh makshelibo b'chinam. And at this point, Pharaoh is hardening his heart for no reason, meaning the next plague that's going to come upon the Egyptians has nothing to do with, if you want to contemporize it, right, military outcomes and diplomacy, but just his being a stubborn, obstinate king for no reason, forcing his own people to suffer. Umikol makom, nevertheless, Ra'u, they saw, Ki Moshe mizdarez lahatir, bechas alehem od. They observed somehow that in the process of these plagues getting worse and worse, Moses was hastening to pray, to supplicate on their behalf, bechas alehem, and had mercy for them. He wanted it to be over too. Bazeh nitgadel kvodo be'enehem. In this regard, the honor that they had for him got larger. Right, as if to say, the subjects of the emperor, of the Pharaoh, recognize that the one fighting against their own king actually has their best interest in mind more than their own leader has best interest in mind. Again, ancient text with modern implications, right right on the surface there. Okay. I think we may have read that last time. We may have read it quickly. I wanted to go back to it. Okay. Any comments or reactions to that before we go to verse 4? Barry, you need a microphone. If you're speaking in the room, bring the microphone as close to your mouth as you can.
So I'm bothered by a question now.
Okay, so Barry, see if you can not speak not in the mic, speak briefly, and I'll try to say it into the mic.
Who was it in Breshit where the wife was taken in, and Pharaoh had a dream, and because of the dream they let them go? Was that Abraham and Sarah?
So Barry is remembering there are several narratives in the book of Genesis where Abraham and Isaac go down into Egypt, and there's a temporary capture of their wives, and then some kind of a nighttime visitation by God that eventually allows them to resolve the situation.
So God had the ability to get into the Pharaoh and change Pharaoh's mind, and the people didn't have to suffer, right? God using the contemporary metaphor, got into Pharaoh's tunnel and took out Pharaoh, and it changed. But in this case, God doesn't go into Pharaoh's tunnel. Instead, we're demolishing the Egyptian people. Why did they have to suffer?
It's a good question without a great answer. Why it is that God, who assumedly is an omnipotent being that could manipulate the situation as God chooses, rather than removing free will from Pharaoh and sparing the people by forcing Pharaoh to relent, lets Pharaoh continue to do what Pharaoh is wont to do, and they're suffering. That's right. And in our world, we have a God who is everything, and we have a world in which God's subjects suffer. That's something that we've never been able to fully resolve as we've thought that through from a philosophical and theological perspective. Rick, I see your hand.
Hi, yes. It's not a trope thing, but
We'll permit it.
whenever I see Eine, the eyes of the people, I always am triggered by in the Canaanites' eyes, we were like grasshoppers. So the Eine are not always reality. So here we have it 3 different times. And they don't need to be there, really. I mean, Vayiten Adonai et chen ha'am. He gave them good stuff. It didn't have to be Be'enei Mitzrayim. That phrase didn't even need to be there. But 3 times, it's the perception of what's going on. So I just wanted to bring that up. The story, there's been famous stories where you tell it from this person's perspective and then that one person, and then you see the differences. So I just thought it was interesting. You don't have many sentences where you have a nay this, a nay that 3 times. So that's all.
Yeah. It's 1 second, Rick. Hector, they can hear this mic pretty well, but the other mics, for some reason, they're not. It's all muffled. It's like they say it's like a hearing test. Rick. Interesting focus on Eine. It's also, and this does not undermine what you said, but just a way of getting to the language, right? The phrase, the vernacular, that grace is found in the eyes of someone. That's how the phrase is constructed. Now, why it's constructed that way is very interesting. But in biblical Hebrew and in modern Hebrew, motzeh chen be'enai, it finds favor in my eyes, is Hebrew's way of saying, I like it. So it also could just be that's just how this phrase or idea is constructed, or there might be something about the doubling and the tripling of the eyes. Yes, Norm.
In the context, the place in when the spies go and they say we must have looked like grasshoppers in their eyes, it's a physical description. They were bigger than us. We were smaller than them. But in this case, I don't think it's that they had this mistaken illusion that Moses is 10 feet tall or something. That is, they could see either that he was wise and good, or more likely that he was really powerful and clearly had God's ear or spoke for God, but somehow was more powerful than Pharaoh. Pharaoh is weak and unable to do, but still doing what he wants to do. It's as if he's emulating a certain candidate for president.
As we fantasize about what the actual Egyptians in this narrative actually felt, right, and what the concept of Moshe finding favor in their eyes meant, we've now named both grand possibilities. Either he found favor because they considered him to be compassionate on their behalf, or he found favor because they realized he was more powerful than their own guy, right? And one way or the other, that shifts their allegiance, right? Either you
much better volume, much better. Thank you, Hector.
Thanks, Hector. Hector Superman. So both of those are possibilities, and we should keep them both hovering because there's no way of knowing for sure which one is the connotation that was implied. Okay, let's go to verse 4, which is the beginning of the fourth aliyah of chapter 11. Sorry, of Parshat Bo. So we're past the halfway mark. I'm not sure if we're past the halfway mark in verses, but definitely in aliyot. The aliyot are not exactly the same size. Matt, do you want to read verse 4? Let's give Matt a microphone. Norm, can you give him his? Yeah. Keep it close and perpendicular.
Okay.
Perpendicular to your face, not to your body.
All right.
No, go more like a 94-degree angle. Could you get a protractor and no, just go talk.
ויאמר משה, כה אמר אדוני, בחצות הלילה אני יוצא בתוך מצרים.
No, that's not as good. I'm sorry. The volume again. Can you switch mics or something?
Let him use yours.
ויאמר משה, כה אמר אדוני.
Okay, but bring it even closer, Matt.
ויאמר משה, כה אמר אדוני, בחצות הלילה.
What was that word before Halayla?
בחצות.
Try again, because you want to say bachatzot.
My hand is in the way of my eye. כחצות הלילה.
That was working, not that.
אני יוצא בתוך מצרים.
Okay. You want to read it one more time, just for good measure?
No. And Moshe said, thus spake God, the Lord God, in the middle of the night or at midnight, I will go out in the midst of Egypt.
Okay, so in verse 4, whatever information has been communicated to Moses in terms of what God is planning on doing, in verse 4, somehow Moses is speaking. It awakens the question we discussed the last few weeks as to whom is he speaking to, because we had learned at the end of chapter 10 that he had already left Pharaoh's presence and he said, you're not going to see my face again. Put that aside for a second. Moses speaking, this is what God hath spaketh. Kachatzot halayla, right? The easiest, simplest way of understanding it is the way Matt translated it as midnight, right? And in modern Hebrew, chatzot means midnight from the root chet tzadi yud means to divide, to cut in half, right? Kachatzot halayla. What about that phrase might make someone wonder if that's the only way of understanding that as midnight? Other mic. Yeah.
It's the kaf, kachatzos.
Right.
If it said chatzos, that's midnight. Kachatzos, it's around midnight.
Right. K is a limiting letter. It means like, similar to, the opposite of exact, right? And when Matt read it the first two times, his brain and his eyes wanted to read it as bachatzot, because that would also have been precise. That Moses said, this is what God said, exactly at midnight, I'm going to come out through the Egyptians. But the k opens up the possibility of questions that it may not mean that, or it may not mean only that. And it seems like a very Picayune exploration, but that's what Midrash is. There's a letter that could have been different. And you can imagine, by the way, right, the difference in between a kaf and a bet is very, very small, right? Reading it now, you can make that error. Just like the difference between the resh and the daled, which is why we articulate the da of the echad and shema. Less people think that we're reading the word as acher, which would suggest that God is other rather than God is one, right? And you can imagine over thousands of years of transmission by manuscript, it's possible that the original was bachatzot halayla, right? But we have received according to the Masoretic tradition, ka chatzot halayla. Okay.
Rabbi, I can't find my raised hand. But can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
So famously, this also influenced one of the jazz greats, Thelonious Monk, to label his famous composition "Round About Midnight," as opposed to exactly at midnight.
And he was referring to this?
Well, I'm making a joke, but this is the famous song, ba 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 bum, ba bum ba ba bum, is "Round About Midnight."
Did we listen to that song in the back roads of Pennsylvania this summer?
I don't think so.
Okay, but you're making a joke. You're not suggesting that it was actually based on that, because if it was actually based on that, that's really wonderful. You're just saying that.
Well, there may be. Okay, I don't know. He may have been influenced by some song or spiritual that he had grown up with, because I think "Round About Midnight," I can't place the song. I think it's actually the lyric to another gospel song. Maybe somebody knows.
Right. Well, if you think about the way time works, and I don't mean to belabor the point, but here I am belaboring the point. Even midnight isn't midnight unless you're in the exact 2 moments of the year where 12 p.m. where you are is exactly halfway between when the sun goes down, the sun comes up. Right. So we use the term to refer to it being in the middle of the night, but it's not really. I see a lot of hands. So Matt has the microphone, then we'll go around to the table.
Just to continue the lyrics of the song include the phrase, "Let our love take wing some midnight, round midnight. Let the angels sing."
Uh-huh. Okay.
So it is religious.
Yeah. Sandy.
I just had the question. Always I've wondered whether chatzot actually means midnight or just in the middle of the night, especially when day starts at night. And does it mean technically midnight in other places?
Right. Well, I guess the question is when English speakers use the word midnight, it can mean several things. It can mean 12 a.m. on the clock, which again, only 2 exact moments of the year is that actually midnight. So normally we use the word midnight to refer to a time on the clock, not where we are in between sundown and sunrise. I think the same is true in terms of chatzot in Hebrew. The question is, what did it mean then? And what did it mean when the Torah used it? And is there a distinction between chatzot and kachatzot? And that's what Rashi is going to try to figure out. But we use it right now not to refer to a technical halfway point, but what we have determined as going to be midnight every night, even if it's only 5/12 of the way through the darkness of the night. Steve?
Yeah, the concept of midnight being 12 is an extremely modern concept. Clocks didn't exist,
Right, we have big relative hours.
Sense of hours. So there's no. Whoa. It's not possible to retroject the modern sense of midnight is to.
Right. Certainly not to the number 12. The question is it possible to retroject the concept of midnight as referring to the middle of the night as opposed to somewhere deep at night, right? I see Rebecca and Leonard's hand up.
Hi. I was just going to comment that saying that it's around midnight, not given the precise time, adds to the anticipation and the anxiety, I would think, of the Egyptians not knowing exactly when this terrible thing is. So it's especially effective.
As a fascinating comment, Rashi has several things to say in this verse, and one of them is going to be an interesting partner to that comment, because it's responding to the similar kind of emotionality and psychology of what the Egyptians might be experiencing it, but not quite reversing it, but coming at it from different angles. So everyone remember what Rebecca just offered. Okay. Anyone else before we look at the Rashi? Okay. Matt, let's look at the Rashi, starting with, Norm.
Do you want to discuss other parts of the sentence before we?
Sure, yeah. Let's finish any things you have on the sentence, and then we'll look at the Rashi.
Okay, because Rashi talks a lot about what we've been discussing, but I think this actually is the most important verse in the Torah. probably in the whole Tanakh, because it says Ani Yotze. And it's God is saying, I will go out in the midst of Egypt. I am not a seraph. I am not a malach. I am not a messenger. I am not an agent or angel or whatever. And I think that's the most important concept that we have probably in the whole Torah. God is the one who redeemed us from Egypt, not anyone else, certainly not Moshe.
Right, and the Haggadah emphasizes that, right? De-emphasizes Moshe and emphasizes God. While we're looking at that phrase, two things I want to say about it. So we've talked a lot about the fact that how we think about tenses of verbs is just very different than the Bible did. So you can't always get all agitated that, hey, how come this is this tense when it should have been that tense? But it's still worth noting that we're talking about a prediction, but the verb is a present tense verb, right? Moses said that God said at or near the middle of the night, Ani Yotze, not Ani Eitze, I will go out, but I am walking. Rendering it into English is already changing it, but if you try to think about it even in Hebrew, that there is a prediction of something that's going to happen, but the verb used to describe the prediction is in present tense. We sometimes do that colloquially, right? We sometimes can imagine ourselves in a future tense and we use a present tense verb, or in the past tense too, but it's interesting that it's there because it didn't have to be. Also interesting, I forgot to mention this before. Look at Onkelos here. Onkelos does something very interesting. One of those times where it's just clear. He's saying, yeah, I know there's an Aramaic word for this, but I'm not translating. I'm going to comment. Va'amar Moshe, Kidnan Amar Adonai, Kifalgut Leila. That's his translation of Kachatzot. Pei Lamed Gimel is an Aramaic and a Hebrew term for splitting. Put that aside for a second. Ana Ani Mitgele Bego Mitzrayim. Mitgele is not an Aramaic word meaning to go out. It's an Aramaic word meaning what? Will reveal myself. Gimel Lamed Yud means revelation, right? So what Onkelos is doing is saying, this is not God saying, I'm taking a stroll. When I come in the middle of the night to smote all of you, consider that a revelation of my deepest, most profound, my truest power, right? There's no way of understanding Onkelos other than saying that rather than choosing the Aramaic word for the Hebrew Yotzei, I'm going to tell you something that I think is actually happening in the narrative. It's interesting. Doesn't do that often. Okay, Rashi. Matt, start with Vayomer Moshe. Yeah.
Vayomer Moshe, Ko Amar Adonai. And Moses said this, so God said this, so spake God.
Right, so that's a quote from the verse.
Right. Vayemdo lifnei Paro, ne'emra lo nuvoah zot. In his standing before Pharaoh, this prophecy was spoken to him.
Right, and you can interject or add, while he was still standing in front of Pharaoh, this is when this prophecy was said. Shaharei
mi sheyatsa milfanav lo hosif lirot panav. Since he left Pharaoh, he did not see his face again, did not continue to see his face again.
Right. The sentence almost makes sense if you flip it. Since we know, because the verse tells us that once he leaves Pharaoh's presence now, he's not going to see his face again, because that's explicitly, it must be, by definition, that this prophecy about the 10th plague happened while he was still standing there, which plays a game with the order of things here, because if this verse, verse 4, and a super commentary on Rashi says also verse 1, that I'm going to bring one more plague. If that happened, like when is God giving the prophecy to Moses for Moses to give it to Pharaoh? Is it? I think maybe Barry or someone else said it last time. Is it an earpiece in Moshe's ear while he's standing there? He's being fed lines by God, and then he says it in front of the Egyptians, and then we're told that Moses is about to leave. But even though we think he's left, he hasn't left because he's still, giving over the things that are being whispered in his ear. It's unclear how to resolve all this. But I guess what Rashi wants us not to think is that the last verse of chapter 10 was a lie. Don't think that the last verse of chapter 10, Where's the Ot Panai? Yeah, the last verse of chapter 10, when it said that you're never going to see my face again. Don't think that was incorrect, such that this scene is another reunion. It's that something is happening all in real time, and he hasn't really fully left Pharaoh's presence yet. Yeah. Okay, Stevie, microphone.
It's possible to read this sequence as though God tells Moshe, now's the time for the people to request stuff from the Egyptians. And Moshe then, on his own volition, understands this to mean, oh, the big one's coming. And then decides to like turn around and say something to Pharaoh. Because, right, there's no explicit, God said to Moshe this. Like it's, well, I'm not sure that I favor that reading, but it's certainly, I think it's possible to read these verses in that way, which is,
well, chapter 11, verse 1. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe od nega echad. That's an explicit God speaking to Moses. The question is, how do we imagine where Moshe is in that moment, right?
And no, but also how much, right? Just how much is Moshe reading into that?
What does that mean?
I mean, God explicitly says that after that, they'll, you'll be gone, right? They'll chase you out. Does he spell out what's going to happen?
Well, in that verse, he says there's going to be another plague, and they're gonna drive you out, and then he gives Moses the instruction about the borrowing of the stuff. So, God, if that's what,
in the next verse, in verse 5, Moshe is going to be much more explicit about what's about to happen.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So that's the first comment that Rashi has. Keep reading, Matt. Now Rashi is going to get into the kachatzot and what it actually means and what it doesn't mean.
Kachatzot halayla, kechelek halayla.
I'm gonna give you the vowels here because it matters, because he's talking on a very particular grammatic point. Hechalek halayla. The difference is, because if you read it as kechelek halayla, chelek is a noun, like a portion of. Hechalek is a gerund, in the dividing of the night.
Halayla. Okay. That's okay. So the key word here is the words he's talking about is kechatzot halayla, and he explains it as the dividing of the night.
Right, and I guess it's interesting. The original readers of Rashi didn't have the vowels. If they did, it would be even more clear that what he's doing by turning kachatzot into kehechalek is saying that chatzot is not a noun, midnight, but the gerund form of a verb in the halving of halve, in the halving of halving. How do you pronounce that word? The halving of the night. Halving of the night, right? Maybe you don't pronounce it.
You don't say it.
You don't say it. And now he goes on.
Okay, so explains what is kechatzot, kemo. Boy, I have trouble reading. Be'alut.
It's going to go to a verse. You might as well look at the screen anyway. He's going to give us two places.
It's a bet though. Be'alot.
Yes.
Be'alot in the rising.
Yeah, he's going to give us two places where the form chatzot, so an a-o two-syllable word, which you might think is a noun, is actually a form of a verb. Again, we'd call it really a gerund in modern English. So the first one is from Job. Look at the screen, chapter 5 of Job, verse 26.
I have one. It's here. The source here says it's from Kings. But
from
Malachim.
Ka'alot?
Yeah.
First Kings 18:36.
It's interesting.
King's Aleph.
All right. So what? Hold on. So all that Rashi does is quote Ka'alot, and I suppose that there's more than one place in Tanakh where he could be referring to, because Rashi doesn't tell you what verse he's quoting. He assumes his readers know Tanakh back and forth like he does. Let's look at the Job one, because that's the one that I pulled up, and we can look at the King's one as well. So look at the screen. This, by the way, this is going to be confusing. What Rashi's doing here is not yet talking about the k versus a b. He's talking about whether chatzot, the a-o sound of that word, is a noun or a verb form. So here's the verse from Job. Tavo bechelaf elei kaver. You're going to come to the grave, kelach, in your ripe old age. And now ka'alot gadish be'ito. It's translated here as shocks of grain are taken away in their season. The are taken away is the English rendering of ka'alot. It's weird use of the word alot in the lifting up of the grain, right? And alot here, the way Rashi's reading it, is not the noun of a taking up, but in the process of the taking up. I know it's a very subtle difference, but it's an important difference to Rashi. So here's an alot word. You might think alot is a noun. It's actually a verb form. What's the exact quotation of Shmuel Aleph? All right, let me find it out. Shmuel Aleph, Yud Chet Lamed Vav.
There it's Ba'alot, Rabbi.
No, there's no Yud Chet Lamed Vav. Maybe it's the Shmuel Bet.
No,
30. It's 36.
Oh,
1836.
Okay. Kings 1 or 2?
1. Kings 1.
1835.
Becharot apas beno.
And my Silverman again says Ba'alot a couple of times. That's a bet.
That's the word, Ba'alot.
Mine also lists Judges 13.
Okay. One at a time. If you're on Zoom, let me call on you because it's hard to just handle if it's being shouted out. Look at the screen. So this is chapter. This is from the first book of Kings. Vayhi ba'alot hamincha, and it was in the presenting of the mincha. And I guess that's another place where the alot, which is the same vowels as chatzot, is not a noun but a verb form. And I suppose there are several other places that he could have been referring to. Okay, put that aside. Go to the next one, Matt.
Yeah, the next one is from Psalms.
Okay,
Psalms, and it says becharot apam beno.
Good.
Banu.
Look at the screen. Right. Azai chayim blaunu. Azai is kind of a biblical oi. They would have blaunu. Bala means to swallow. They would have swallowed us chayim alive. When or how? Bacharut apam banu. In the flaming of their noses upon us. And even though flaming, again, in English grammar could be a noun or a verb, it's a noun because it's formed from the gerund of a verb. In the active flaming of their noses against us. So by quoting these two, maybe more than two, or we don't know exactly which one he was quoting ka'alot, Rashi saying kachatzot halayla does not mean a thing, but rather an active, a part of a verb form. Okay, keep going, Matt.
Zehu pshoto liyeshvo al ofnav. This is the clear or the simple meaning of sitting on his bicycle.
Oh God, that's a good. Was that intentionally funny or accidentally funny? Zepshuto. This is the simple meaning: to settle the meaning of the verse on its style. Ofen is a style in addition to being a wheel, right? Like he's from the Department of Redundancy department here. By saying zepshuto, he's basically saying that settles it liyashev alaf nav. Okay, and why is that the simplest pshat?
She'en chatzot shem davar shel chatzi. Since the word chatzot isn't a noun, isn't a half of a noun.
Isn't the noun that means half?
That means half.
It's the verb form that means having. Okay. Now, why is that so significant? That's another question. But he's very adamant that he wants us to understand the precise grammar and construction of this phrase. It's Ibn Ezra does these things as well, not necessarily in this verse. He wants to make sure the reader knows exactly what every word means, how it's constructed, not just what the general sense of the meaning is. Now that he does all that, he says, and by the way, the rabbis have an interesting drash in that, and now he's going to move from the part of the word of chatzot to the part of the word of k, the k and not the b. Okay, come on.
Verabotenu darshuhu kemo kechatzi halayla.
That's what you have?
Yeah.
Not kemo kibechatzot halayla?
No.
Interesting. Okay.
And our rabbis interpreted this as kemo bechatzi halayla, like half of the night.
Right. So the rabbis drashed it out as if the k really means something like, as opposed to exactly at. And now he's going to give the reason why. And I'm going to show you, when we're going to read Rashi, then I'm going to show you the original Midrash in Masechet Brachot. Go ahead.
The Amru she'amar Moshe kachatzot. And they said that Moshe said kachatzot.
And that he said kachatzot not by accident, but intentionally. Dafka, he said kachatzot and not precisely bachatzot. Why?
Mishma samuch lo, which sounds similar to it.
Which means mashma, near it, around, right? What was the Thelonious Monk quote? Like round about midnight, right?
Around midnight.
That Moshe did that intentionally. If anyone who hasn't read ahead wants to guess, what would be the rhetorical or narrative value or advantage for Moshe to not mark a specific time on the calendar, but rather to make it imprecise? Rebecca's suggestion before was that it makes it more frightening to not know exactly when it's coming. Anyone want to anticipate what might be coming, what the rabbis might have been saying? I know Rashi explains it. Okay, keep going.
Also, in the Haggadah, he says, Harei ani kiven shivim shana.
Around.
I'm like 70, and the explanation is that he was really much younger and he was aged by his tribulations or something.
There's a lot of commentary on the verse in Parshat, I forgot, it's in Tazria or Masorah, where you where the Kohen says kinega, right? That you there's something like a blight on your skin, but there's a stance of humility, of being able to be willing to say, I'm not sure exactly what it is. Okay, that ke is a helpful limitation of certainty. Go ahead.
Ola fanav, ola acharav, either before it or after it.
It could be a little before midnight, could be a little after midnight, and again, midnight not just meaning 12 on the clock, as Stevie said, but middle of the night. V'lo amar
bachatzot.
Didn't say exactly in the halving of the night. Why?
Shema itu Itstagnene Paro v'yomru Moshe badaihu.
Okay.
Badaihu. So lest the advisors, is that right?
Astrologers.
The astrologers of Pharaoh would mistakenly say that Moses was badai. I don't know what that means.
Put a comma there. Lest Pharaoh's astrologers and time watchers would make an error in their calculations, right?
Right.
And since their sense of when the middle of the night would be might have been different than what Moshe's and God's were, because as Steve said, they didn't have clocks. It wasn't 12 on the clock. It was just trying to figure out what's the exact middle of the night. And if they like, the idea is that Moses said that it's going to happen exactly in the middle of the night. And we've calculated the middle of the night is right now. He hasn't come yet. He must be a badai. What's a badai? A liar, right? A prevaricator. And that would, God forbid that on the night of Exodus, anything about Moses and God's precision can be critiqued. Don't give an exact time, right? Give a general time. Okay? Aval.
I thought it was finished. Let's see. Shema Yitu. That's as far as my version goes here, I think. Oh.
You don't have after their Badai Hush Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu?
No, I don't think so.
So this is clearly a commentary of Rashi, of which there are several different versions. I'll share what I have. Some of you may have it. Aval, however, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, Yodea Itav. God knows exactly when the middle of the night is every night. Uraga'av. And God knows God's times and seconds. Amar, and God said, Bachatzot, explicitly. Now, here's why this is really now very interesting, Because as I read this and I was preparing, I was thinking to myself, why is Rashi adding this? Particularly because God doesn't say Bachatzot. Right? It's not like he's referring to a verse where God specifically says the phrase that he's saying Moshe is not saying. Later on, if you look at chapter 12, where is it? Turn ahead to chapter 12:30. Sorry, chapter 12:29. When Exodus is actually happening, not being spoken, but happening, the Torah says, not God says, but the Torah says, Vayahi, and it was Bachatzi Halayla, B, not K, seemingly at the exact half point of the night. So the Torah says that later on, but it's not that God ever uses the language Bachatzot. So it makes me think now even more so that this last little piece of Rashi, anyone have the Torah Chaim in front of them? Carol, is this comment in the Torah Chaim? So it's not even in it with the parentheses that says that it's not in the first printing. That's fascinating. So this is probably not original to Rashi. I don't know how it got into the version I'm using. And it makes sense that it wouldn't have been original to Rashi, because Rashi would not have said the phrase, since God knows the exact time, that's why God said the words Bachatzot, because God never says the word Bachatzot. That's a helpful resolution of a conundrum as I was thinking about this. Okay. Thoughts, comments, reactions to all of what Rashi just said. I see there's some hands up on the Zoom. Who were they? Renee and then Rick.
Maybe it wasn't so exact because it made it more open-ended for the Egyptians so that they could then decide on when it was going to be.
That the Egyptians would decide when the angel of death would come?
Yeah, that it was more open-ended. So rather than saying precisely at midnight and what that midnight means, that they had the choice to decide also on interpret when that midnight would be.
Yeah.
And that phrase that you were reading is also bracketed in my book, and it talks about the warning to Pharaoh.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but the language, the word itself does not appear. I do not believe in any part of the laying out of the 10 plagues that in God's mouth we have the word Bachatzot. Going back to what Rebecca said before, right? It's terrifying. It's equally but differently terrifying to know that something awful is happening and you know exactly when. And it's equally terrifying to know that something terrible is happening, but you don't know exactly when, right? But both of those are awful to imagine. Something horrific is going to happen, and the countdown to the exact moment can be horrific, or sitting and just waiting and not knowing when it's going to come, right? Let me get to Rick and then Sandy. Rick, was your hand up again or still?
No, I just wanted to comment back to that Onkelos. The end of his comment on the verse is, instead of Betoch Mitzrayim, he's got Begoy Mitzrayim. So
that's just Aramaic. That's just just means that's an exact translation, not goy but go.
Well,
go means toch.
It's not goy. I thought there was a yid there, which I thought was nice that God was revealing himself to the people of Egypt too. Yeah. But it's like Betoch. It's just in the middle of. It's not to the people, huh?
Correct.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's a cigar, just being a cigar in that situation. There's a Talmudic construct called amigo argument, which is just the Aramaic form of the word mitoch, and it's an argument that basically says that if someone could have made a stronger defense of themselves, but they made a weaker defense of themselves, then their defense is more believable. Because by choosing not to exaggerate and make the stronger argument, but make the weaker argument, then it's a more trustworthy argument. It's called amigo because it's mitoch she, from the fact that he could have said this, but said this instead. Therefore, the argument has more veracity. It's just a translation of mitoch, migo. Yeah.
Okay.
Sandy.
I'm glad whoever invented this, added it, because it's kind of charming to be thinking about Moshe editing God, right? Saying, oh, hold on. I know these people and they're going to try to find some argument. We've been through 9 plagues and each time they're finding excuses, and he's editing the same way that Adam edited God, this past week. So he's translating.
That Moses is translating.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also, I think, unintentionally to me, somewhat humorous. It's a little Monty Python-ish that Rashi through the Midrash, I'm going to show you the Midrash, is imagining the Egyptians, even at this stage of the process, saying, we can catch him on a 2-minute mistake, right? So he said midnight, and our astrologer says, this is midnight. Guess what? No 10th plague, and they're celebrating because for 2 minutes, they think that the 10th plague is supposed to come, doesn't come. They think they're fine, and then whammo, right? It's turning them into, it's imagining them as foolishly proud that they were able to somehow evade the last plague, and we, the reader, know, yeah, it's just coming 2 minutes later. Don't be,
or 2 minutes earlier.
or 2 minutes earlier.
Like, no, that wasn't.
I imagine
Right.
the headline the following morning, terrible disaster.
Norm.
The headline the following morning in an Egyptian newspaper: terrible disaster strikes. Firstborn all over the country are dead.
But God
astrologers say it wasn't really God and Moshe because
exactly
it was a minute late.
That's exactly right. Right. I think that this is the Talmud and Rashi using Talmud to laugh a bit at the Egyptians and in their plight. Right. Look at I want to show you the original in the Gemara. Go ahead, Steve. I'm pulling it up.
Yeah, I was just going to say in the Gemara, it may or may not be playing for laughs, but the end point is to say, and thus you should learn to, say I don't know, as opposed to right. Like it makes a serious point out of it.
Right. So look on the screen. So how Rashi is wielding this in his commentary on the verse, it has a different tone than the original Midrash he's quoting from, and I'm going to put a parentheses there. This is one of the places that Rashi could be quoting from. Many Midrashim appear in many different collections of Midrashim, so it may not be that he's relying specifically on this one, the Talmud. This is from Brachot, page 4, which means this is the third page of the Talmud. The Talmud begins in Brachot and it begins on page 2. This is a very, very early part of the Talmud. The context is that the previous conversation is whether or not King David knew something specific and whether he was in a place of awareness or not awareness. And once they talked about David's knowing or not knowing, they go to Moses' knowing and not knowing. So look at the phrase, the Kevan de Moshe Hava Yada. Since it's the case that Moses himself certainly knew the difference between around midnight and midnight itself, Lama Leila Memar Kachatzot. Why would Moses have used an inexact phrase? Moshe Kasavar. This is what Moses was thinking, which is interesting because the way Rashi wields it seems to suggest that this was God's plan to do this, lest Moshe be called a liar rather than Moses's. In the Midrash itself, it's Moses thinks to himself, Shema yitu itstagnine Pharaoh, lest his astrologers make a miscalculation. That's an exact quote that Rashi uses, and they might say, Moshe Badaihu, Moses is a prevaricator, the Amar Mar, because we all know the famous saying, Lamed Lashoncha Lomar Eini Yodea. Teach your tongue how to say the words, I don't know. Shema Titbadeh Beteaches, lest you appear to be a liar because you claim knowledge that you didn't have exactly, and you're just going to get entangled in something more complicated, right? So I'm so glad you brought that up, Stevie. The Talmud is using this as a way of saying Moses was teaching something all humanity should learn. If you don't know exactly when something's going to happen, or you don't know something with exact certainty, share your doubt, which is something that most modern people have a hard time doing. Share your uncertainty, because once you lay a claim to certainty, you're going to get called on it. The way Rashi uses it almost shows is shining negative light on the Egyptians feeling so smug that, yes, their sons died, but it was 2 minutes off of what they calculated. And so they got one over Moses. The way the Talmud is using it is shining light on Moses in modeling a certain humility in articulation of your beliefs. Yes, Barry and then Matt. Let's give the microphone.
I have this footnote here that kind of puts it together, I think. Going back to the idea of it being a gerund rather than a noun. If it were a noun, chatzrot would mean at approximately midnight, which could not be the case here because God certainly does not need to speak in approximations.
Yeah. Matt,
Yeah, if I can read a little bit from Ibn Ezra.
Please.
Down here, he says
on this verse?
no, about something else.
No, I mean, I'm saying I'll pull it up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
This exact verse.
Yeah, I won't read the whole thing.
11:4.
11:4.
Okay.
It's common knowledge that it's beyond the ken of a wise man to ascertain the exact moment of noon without great effort in the use of large copper instruments. It goes without saying that it's much harder to ascertain the more difficult time of midnight. I believe that there is no need for all of this, says Arthur, since the meaning of kachatzot halayla, about midnight, is when the first half of the night has passed. The same is the case with ba chatzi halayla.
That's the verse we looked at it before.
In chapter 12. It came to pass at midnight. It refers to the remaining half of the night. And his other proof texts are, and it came to pass at midnight, b'chatzi halayla, which is from Ruth, and at midnight, chatzot halayla, which is from Psalms, and that these are convincing proof of this.
Yeah, convincing proof of the fact that the k can be understood not to be a limiting or a qualifier. It just means about halfway through the night. Yeah, good. Okay. Every once in a while, it is interesting to source check Rashi and see how he has changed sometimes the language of the drash he's quoting from and how he's changing the application of it, right? Okay, good. Let's go to verse 5. Let's hear from someone on the screen we haven't heard from today. Sue, do you want to read verse 5?
Did you say Sue?
I did.
Oh, okay. Sure. Verse 5. Umei kol bachor ba'eretz Mitzrayim. Page turn. Mi bechor paro hayeshev al kiso ad bechor ashivcha ad bechor ashivcha asher achar harechim Arechaim v'chol bechor v'hema. Chol bechor v'hema. And every firstborn died in the land of Egypt.
Still in the language of prediction, this is a vav hayipuch. Mate looks like past tense, but it means future. It means yamut.
All die. The firstborn of all the land of Egypt will die.
Mm-hmm.
And of the Pharaoh's firstborn that sits on his throne, on his chair, on his throne, until the shivcha, until the firstborn of all the maids, of all the servants, asher achar harechaim. I don't know.
Hard phrase. Rechaim are grindstones, right? It's an image of the servants at manual labor, right? Why it's achar is interesting, right? So the firstborn, not only of Pharaoh who sits in the highest place in society, but also the firstborn who sits, right, at the lowest place in society, down at the lowest grindstone, the chol.
And all of the firstborn of all of the beasts, the cattle.
Okay, so this is the continuing specificity of the prediction of the 10th plague, that there's going to be a complete calamity, every firstborn in all strata of society. I'm giving away a Rashi a little bit, which we're not going to get till next week, right? This is something that happens in all languages, that when you say from A to Z, you don't just mean A and Z. You also mean B, C, D, E, F, G, et cetera, right? So from the highest to lowest, and also the animals. I see a bunch of hands up. So I'll go Diane, Larry, Elon, and Rick, and then we'll close.
Yeah. So I know you discussed this at the beginning, and I was preoccupied picking up Izzy and didn't quite follow. This is apparently, and according to Rashi, Moses is still speaking to Pharaoh. He's in front of Pharaoh saying this.
Right. Rashi says that even though the chapter 10 ends with Moses taking leave of Pharaoh and saying, I'm not going to see you again, that somehow this scene is thrown back into that. Correct.
Right. No, I understand. And I talked about it before. We talked about it before. I have to go back. But here's my, I won't say confusion, but astonishment. What Moses is saying to Pharaoh right now is that your son is going to die. The impertinence of that is astounding. And one would think that Pharaoh would react exactly to that. Either get out of my presence or smite this man immediately or whatever it happens to be. And I know that we're going to go on in the subsequent verses to a fuller description, but I'm just commenting on how astounding it is that Moses would make such a direct and personal threat to Pharaoh and to his family. And we're just sort of reading it like we want to understand what it is that Moses is predicting is going to happen.
Meaning, if I understand correctly, we're saying the fact that Rashi has emphasized that this is not Moses making some grand generic pronouncement, but is still speaking to Pharaoh's face, then the language speaking about Pharaoh in the third person to Pharaoh about the death of your son is at the apex of impertinence.
Right. I mean, imagine if someone standing in front of you says, or in front of me, I won't make it personal to you, says to me, and your firstborn son, Reuben, is going to die by this action that I am in part responsible for.
Yeah.
At that moment, I don't think I would restrain myself. And I don't think Pharaoh would restrain himself either. I'm not criticizing. I'm just, it's even more astonishing to me, set in the context of Moses speaking to Pharaoh, than what we are discussing or understanding.
Yeah, and your comment is even more interesting given the fact that, if I can say it this right way, because in the flow of the text, Moses already left Pharaoh's presence. We never get Pharaoh's theoretical response to this because they've already parted. And in this mini scene that we're throwing back into that scene, we don't have a reaction by Pharaoh. So we can only imagine if Moses was actually saying this in Pharaoh's presence, what Pharaoh's response might have been. Fascinating.
Exactly.
Elon, your hand went down? No, here they are. Go ahead, Elon.
So the thing that strikes me the most about this sentence, and unlike Larry, I am criticizing it, which is the notion of the broad-based nature of the punishment and why it is necessary to also kill the firstborn of the slaves who bear no responsibility whatsoever for the predicament of the Israelites. Yeah. And to think that once again it's very disturbing. So
and when we get to Rashi, we will be somewhat satisfied by the fact that Rashi is disturbed, and less satisfied, I would think, by his answer. And again, what's ancient is modern, right? Why do innocents die along with the wicked who are punished, right? So
I would argue this is more than collateral damage, though, meaning that there are examples in earlier plagues where it was collateral damage. This is not. This is specifically, we're just going to, we're going to kill the firstborn of the slaves as well. It's not collateral damage.
And Rashi's going to be alert to that and then give a less than satisfying answer, I would think, to most of us. I have to be somewhere at 10 and I can't be late, so we'll end it now. We'll start next week. Hopefully the audio will be better. Be well. Elon, go get him tonight. Bring your mojo.
I will. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.